Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you have your coffee, but I'm going to venture to promise you that this conversation is going to be stimulating enough that you're not going to need it. My name is Juliet Sorensen, and it's my distinct honor to moderate and participate in this morning's discussion, Corruption in an Era of Climate Change, an Ever-Closing Circle. I'm joined by my colleagues here on the panel, who I'll introduce in just a moment, Professor Stephen Gardner, Julia Newman, and Jim Anderson. I know we are also joined by some colleagues in the audience who we've reached out to seek their expertise in the moderated discussion that follows. So, briefly, in terms of format, the folks up here will each speak for about 7 minutes. No slides. The days of stuffy lectures in an amphitheater are the thing of the past, and I say that as a professor myself. I will then seek to synthesize their remarks in a moderated conversation, and we will then open it to discussion with all of you. I do encourage questions and comments at that stage. As I understand it, this is also being broadcast virtually, and somebody, I'm not sure who, is going to be monitoring the virtual attendance and will give me the high sign if people have questions in the virtual chat, which is also most welcome. So I'll introduce myself for starters. My name is Juliet Sorensen. As I said, I'm a professor at Northwestern Law School, associated with its Center for International Human Rights. And my teaching, research, and advocacy interests include public corruption and also global health as a human right. I am the author of multiple books on corruption and human rights. As I told my colleagues, my students are currently in their reading period, unless some of them are taking a study break to tune in online, because they have just taken my class on public corruption and the law, local, national, international. Prior to my joining the faculty of Northwestern Law School, I was an assistant U.S. attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice in Chicago for 7 years, where my focus included public corruption, fraud, and human rights violators. Introducing my distinguished colleagues. Stephen Gardner is professor of philosophy and the Ben Rabinowitz Professor of the Human Dimensions of the Environment at the University of Washington in Seattle, where he's also the director of the program on ethics. Steve is the author of A Perfect Moral Storm, The Ethical Tragedy of Climate Change, and co-author of Debating Climate Ethics. His edited books include The Ethics of Geoengineering the Good Climate and the Oxford Handbook of Environmental Ethics. His latest book, which we were just discussing, Dialogues on Climate Justice, tells the story of Hope, a name intentionally chosen, I assume. Hope, a fictional protagonist whose life is shaped by a series of conversations about ethics and justice in a climate-challenged world. A book I look forward to reading. Jim Anderson, immediately to my right, is a lead governance specialist for the governance global practice at the World Bank. Jim is an economist and started his career in Mongolia, where he lived from 1993 through 1997, researching institutional reform, the informal sector, and the impacts of large-scale privatization. He took these interests and began applying them to governance challenge, including anti-corruption and reform in the judiciary in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. He has also lived and worked in Vietnam, where he has focused on transparency, anti-corruption, and human rights. I have to use this phrase because it's a lively phrase in Jim's bio. Jim remains a governance data junkie and makes no effort to kick the habit. So I look forward to learning from him in that capacity. Last but hardly least, Julia Newman has worked for the London-based NGO Environmental Investigation Agency since 1997. The mission of EIA is to investigate, expose, and campaign against environmental crimes. I said to Julie, and I look forward to hearing more about the nature of their investigative approach. He joined the organization as an investigator and has carried out field investigations into a range of environmental crimes, including illegal logging, smuggling of ozone-depleting chemicals, and hazardous waste, as well as the illicit trade in ivory and tiger parts. He has worked with NGOs in Indonesia, Myanmar, and Tanzania on field documentation skills and is currently the campaign director at EIA. Prior to joining EIA, he worked as a journalist, a skill set that I'm sure is relevant to your work at EIA. Okay, so I just want to spend a few moments speaking to the title of this panel, because I'm the person who came up with it, and perhaps you're wondering what I meant by an ever-closing circle. So I mentioned that I began my career as an assistant U.S. attorney, and in that capacity I worked for several years on a multi-agency investigation involving bribery in the City of Chicago Department of Buildings and Zoning. I'm sure you're shocked to hear that there might have been bribery in Chicago's Departments of Buildings and Zoning. That was a joke. But in any event, it sharpened my interest in the causes and drivers of corruption, conditions that can be so ripe that without pre-existing quality controls in place, corruption can become almost a natural thing that follows. In about 2014, I don't know if it was my curated anti-corruption Twitter feed or what, but I happened to come upon an article about a federal prosecution in the District of New Jersey that was focused on a company that had paid bribes to New Jersey Transit in exchange for an exclusive contract to clear away snow after a snowstorm and the tracks. Now, New Jersey Transit has commuters. It's obviously that's how it makes its money, commuters going into New York. And so you can imagine that this is an important and lucrative contract. The article also made the point that the snowstorm that had clobbered New Jersey was highly inconsistent with average snowfall in New Jersey, with the severity of storms in New Jersey. And as we know, we are living not only in an era of global warming, but it is inextricably linked to extreme weather. That is what began my personal interest in corruption in an era of climate change, and research that has focused on extreme weather events, the damage to infrastructure that follows, the emergency setting and lack of quality controls in a rush to rebuild. Schools must reopen, potable water must come out of the taps, electricity must turn back on. And in that genuine urgency, those gatekeeping functions, those evaluations of contractors on the basis not of personal relationships or bribes offered, but the basis of merit, the best interests of the body politic, that, as I said, make it a ripe condition for bribes to be passed. This happens on myriad occasions throughout the world. One egregious example from here in the United States would be New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2004. So, quality controls are disregarded, corrupt transactions may occur, those contracts to rebuild are dispersed, and the community is rebuilt. Those highways are paved again, those buildings are rebuilt. But without those anti-corruption measures existing, they may not be built to code, they may be built with a lack of oversight, they may be built with substandard materials. And we know now that we live in an era of increased frequency of extreme weather. So the next extreme weather event is going to come along. and the same thing is going to happen. But without incorporating an anti-corruption mindset as part of mitigation to climate change, the same pattern will occur, but in an ever-closing circle, truly a vicious circle that becomes tighter over time. This was what sparked my own engagement in this space many years ago, and it's for this reason that I'm excited to dialogue with all of you and my distinguished colleagues today. So that's enough from me for the time being. With that, Steve, over to you.
So thanks to everyone for being here, and let me also thank the IACC and especially Bryce Bomer for the kind invitation to come and speak today. It struck me that the one other occasion I was asked specifically to speak about my work on corruption, based on mainly a book chapter that I have on climate change, it was to a society of Jane Austen's studies, which, because the main example in that chapter is drawn from one of Jane Austen's novels. So it's funny how academic work can take you to different places. So a 5-minute presentation is basically a philosopher's worst nightmare. Philosophers like presenting detailed arguments and taking their time about working through them. So given the time constraints, rather than offer arguments, I'm simply going to outline some basic ideas and conclusions in the hope of provoking some discussion. And I'll begin with a quick summary and offer a few brief remarks about the main points. So if you want to know more, please feel free to press me in Q&A or in the hallways, or even go so far as to look at some of my wider work. So my main claims are that climate change is fundamentally an ethical challenge and justice is central to it. So I call the challenge a perfect moral storm. My second claim is that so far humanity's response has been a spectacular moral failure. The perfect moral storm analysis has long predicted that there was a serious risk of moral failure here, and also that corruption would play a major role. Fortunately, the analysis also suggests some strategies for doing better, and I think that the anti-corruption movement can help with these strategies. Examples include insisting on following the ethics, not just or even primarily the science, promoting what I think of as active transparency, practicing defensive ethics to protect norms of justice and intergenerational ethics, and finally advocating for better institutions, including ultimately new intergenerational institutions, and perhaps even my proposal for a global constitutional convention for future generations. So that's the summary. Let's begin with the claim that climate change is fundamentally an ethical challenge and should be understood analytically as a perfect moral storm. The motivating idea here is that climate change brings together a number of severe challenges to humanity's ability to behave ethically. It lays down the gauntlet to us as ethical agents and to our social and political systems. Now, I don't have time here to explore the details of the perfect moral storm analysis. However, let me highlight 3 especially salient dimensions of injustice. First, there are skewed vulnerabilities. For instance, those countries and populations that are most vulnerable to severe climate impacts are typically the least responsible. By contrast, those most responsible for climate change are typically much less vulnerable, at least in the short to medium term. Second, climate threats play out against a background of injustice within a global system that is itself compromised and distorted by, among other things, structural inequalities, sexism, racism, and the legacy of colonialism. And third, the perfect moral storm analysis emphasizes the threat of intergenerational injustice. Most centrally, there's a real prospect of earlier generations implementing what I call a tyranny of the contemporary against the young and other future generations, where this involves the generation holding political power, exploiting its intergenerational position in order to impose grave risks on the future, often for the sake of modest or comparatively moderate benefits to itself. So my second claim was that so far humanity's response and the international community's response has failed to meet the ethical challenge of the perfect moral storm, and so amounts to a spectacular moral failure. As a prime example, the major international agreements such as Rio, Kyoto, Copenhagen, and Paris have been spectacular failures at this point. For instance, annual emissions are now up by more than 40%. The 1.5 degree target is currently on life support, we're told, and the second major target, staying below 2 degrees, also looks under serious threat. Third, despite the issue of skewed vulnerabilities, policy analysts tell us that the Paris Agreement is most beneficial to the US and China and least beneficial to Africa, the worst affected continent. And fourth, the threat to the future seems to be growing rapidly and arguably spiraling out of control. As the UN Secretary General has put it, instead of cutting emissions by 6 to 7% per year, which is needed for 1.5 to be realistic, countries are planning for increases of 2% per year, and as a result, we are currently headed for, quote, thundering temperature rises of 3 to 5 degrees this century, end of quote. Given this, it's not too much to say that to this point, the UNFCCC process has been a failure. Now, the perfect moral storm analysis has been highlighting the risk of moral failure and criticizing conventional policies and institutions for more than 20 years. Alas, it has proved depressingly insightful. Corruption is a key part of the problem. Some of the relevant corruption is of a fairly traditional sort, including bribery, extortion, and the general manipulation of climate policy by overtly bad actors intent on undermining climate action for the sake of their own profit and with no regard for the well-being or rights of others. We will hear numerous examples of these kinds of corruption at this conference. My focus is on a different kind of corruption that I call moral corruption. This typically involves the distortion or perversions of the ways in which we think and talk about the climate problem. Such distortion affects what kinds of proposals are made and the kinds of institutions we both build and avoid building. Unfortunately, this kind of corruption is often deeper and harder to confront than more conventional forms of corruption. More positively, the perfect storm analysis suggests some strategies for doing better, and I think the anti-corruption community is in a good position to contribute to such strategies. For example, I propose that the IACC and other groups should endorse, promote, and practice the following strategies. First, they should emphasize that effective climate action requires following the ethics rather than merely following the science, where following the ethics includes both respecting the science but also keeping it in its place. And I can say more about that later. Second, anti-corruption groups should engage in what I call defensive ethics that protects norms of justice and intergenerational ethics against becoming degraded or marginalized by the forces that resist them. Third, they should promote transparency about the justice implications of various kinds of climate policy, norms, and institutions, including by advocating for active transparency around salient issues of justice, as well as simply pushing for disclosure in a more passive way. Intergenerational transparency should be especially emphasized. Fourth and finally, the anti-corruption community should advocate for better institutions. Here, I would emphasize the need for new intergenerational institutions that neutralize the tyranny of the contemporary. To achieve this, elsewhere I've been arguing for a global constitutional convention for future generations, akin to other constitutional conventions that have occurred in countries around the world, but this time aimed at protecting future generations over the very long term. I'd be happy for any help in promoting that effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And having said that 5 minutes is a philosopher's worst nightmare, congratulations, you clocked in at 8. Wonderful. Okay, next we will be hearing from Jim Anderson.
So thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation to come and join this discussion on a couple of very important topics and the intersection between them. And thank you all also for coming to the session. So I'm from the World Bank. I work in the governance global practice, and my focus is on anti-corruption, thought of in a broad enough way that we're not only talking about enforcement aspects of controlling corruption, but also the policies and institutions that help make corruption less likely. Other parts of the World Bank focus more specifically on climate change. All of us focus on a mission of trying to help the world eliminate extreme poverty, and also what we call boost shared prosperity. So we also have some concern about inequality. These two agendas come together in a way such that clearly there's a motivational aspect to this, where the climate change challenges are already very large, and corruption on the one hand can be seen as something that is not needed and will make the response to climate change less effective. Addressing climate change calls for large investments. It calls for revisions of regulatory schemes, disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction and preparedness, of course, also very important. To some extent, controlling corruption with regard to many of these things is the same as controlling corruption that we would emphasize in any case, whether we were talking about climate change or not. But what's interesting is to try to think of what's a little bit different about the intersection between these two agendas. And there are several things. I know we're going to hear a lot also about various aspects of environmental protection that are closely related to climate change and how corruption undermines those efforts. But we can also think of things like the energy transition and transition more towards renewable energy. So what's different about this? We have new technologies, we have evolving technologies, we have need for subsidies, complex regulation in many cases, value chain analyses that have been done for different types of renewables suggest a lot of corruption risks in there. For hydro, there's the obvious complexity of it. Land acquisition, extremely important, and also very much at risk for corruption. Solar, subsidies, rebates, tax incentives, in many countries mandates, curtailment issues. Wind, also data falsification, land acquisition, curtailment. All of these sorts of complexities in a way open up space for additional corruption, and they require a little bit of extra attention. I think it's also worth mentioning that corruption is something that favors the status quo. And when it comes to addressing climate change, the status quo is not enough. And what do I mean by corruption favors the status quo? I'll give you one of my favorite charts. We don't have a PowerPoint, but I can describe it to you. We have a question on our country opinion survey that we ask of stakeholders in countries where the World Bank works around the world about priorities and so forth. But one of the questions says, when economic and social reforms fail or are slow to take place, what is the reason? Of course, a lot of things come to mind, from political obstacles to low capacity to coordination issues. But actually, the average across countries, the number one answer is corruption. So once those corrupt networks exist, they do not favor the changes that would be required to address something like climate change. Now, a lot of countries are not on track. And globally, we're not on track to meet targets for renewable energy. So addressing this is extremely important. What can we do about it? So from the governance global practice perspective, we contribute to this dialogue by focusing on public sector management institutions. We conduct something called a climate change institutional assessment. And this brings in a way, specific application of some good principles that we apply to government operations generally, but also brings specifically to the question of climate change. So, for example, open government principles, transparency, participation, accountability, et cetera, but focus specifically on what needs to be done in order to meet obligations and to meet what has to be done to control or to address climate change. So transparency over what? Transparency over things like the regulatory frameworks, risk information, budgetary and fiscal information, measurement, reporting, participation, extremely important in the policy change process, budgeting, monitoring, and of course accountability and throughout all of these dimensions, also very important. And we work, of course, with countries around the world. We have 189 member countries, but a smaller number of developing countries are our main clients, and we work with them to try to help them prepare to do a better job of addressing climate. We also have a number of what we call global public goods, or global knowledge, I should say, to try to help countries address some of these things. When we talk about renewables, often they're set up as a public-private partnership, and this can also be very complex, and in some cases the governments are not in the best position to bargain, and they're faced with renegotiations and so forth. So we try to give some good practices on how to deal with those PPPs. Similarly, state-owned enterprises is a major field of work for the World Bank. So I think the bottom line from our perspective is that the developing country perspective is extremely important in this regard, and it's imperative to be sure that we think of this from both sides. So climate change requires robust approaches to preventing and controlling corruption in order to be successful, and also the people who work on anti-corruption need to reorient a bit to be sure that we are focusing on climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. And for those who are just joining us now, I will reiterate our format here in this interactive discussion. My colleagues and I are speaking for about 7 minutes. I will then synthesize the remarks here for something of a moderated discussion among the four of us, and then I will open it to an interactive discussion with all of you and encourage questions and comments, as well as those who are tuning in virtually. Julian Newman, over to you.
Thanks. Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to this session. As our name suggests, the Environmental Investigation Agency, we're an NGO. We spend a lot of time investigating various forms of environmental crime. We try and expose how these crimes are committed, and we use that information to either improve enforcement or to lobby for policy change. So that's what we do. And today I just want to share with you a few examples of cases we've worked on where there's a clear nexus between environmental crime and corruption, and to explain how these cases came about and what needs to be done to try and tackle environmental crime. First of all, to set the scene, environmental crime is regarded as the fourth largest form of transnational organised crime after guns, people and drugs. It's one of the fastest growing forms of transnational organised crime, and the response by governments around the world has been quite slow to tackle these crimes. They're often seen as a high profit and low risk crime for criminals who make lots and lots of money out of destroying our environment. Give one example, Interpol estimates that forest crimes involving illegal logging, timber trafficking, generate up to $150 billion in profits a year for criminal enterprises. So it's a big problem, and many of these crimes directly affect the climate, and we all know about the climate crisis. And also a key enabler of these crimes is corruption. Corruption is widespread in these crimes, and we're having problems in terms of tackling that corruption, and I'll explain why in a moment. So first of all, let's talk through some real cases, yeah? So let's go to Indonesia, a place I've worked for years. Indonesia has some wonderful forests, beautiful environment, many beautiful species, and lots of indigenous communities, and these are all impacted by rampant illegal logging over the years in Indonesia. We've done a lot of work in the field over there. And one case we came across a few years back was in Papua province in the east of Indonesia. And there we came across a case where there was a police sergeant called Labora Sitorus, who in his spare time also ran a very major illegal logging operation, taking valuable merbau timber from protected areas around Papua, West Papua province, and sending it on to Java for processing and onward export. When he was finally exposed for his crimes, there were some financial investigations, his financial investigations revealed that $125 million passed through his bank accounts. That's not bad pay for a police sergeant. He was tried. He was given a 2-year sentence initially with no anti-money laundering charges, what we might call a hometown verdict, as he was tried in the hometown where he was based and obviously got off quite lightly. Thankfully, he went to the Court of Appeal and he was given a stronger sentence, and he was also found guilty of money laundering. So it's important to follow the money in these cases, because when you think about corruption, corruption is all about money. The only way you can expose corruption is to follow those money trails. So it was partly successful because he went behind bars, but he was never tried for corruption, despite being a police officer who clearly used his position to ransack the forests of Papua. He was never tried, never found guilty for corruption charges. A more successful case came from across in western Indonesia, in Riau province, where the Anti-Corruption Commission, called the KPK, got involved in an important case where the governor of Riau province was found to have illegally issued permits for land clearance to 9 companies. These permits were obtained through corruption, and it led to those companies destroying 30,000 hectares of forests in that province, leading to state losses of $23 million. In this case, he was tried appropriately, got 14 years in jail. And that was a good example of when you get the anti-corruption bodies involved in a case early on, you can get some good outcomes. Moving across to the Vietnam-Cambodia border, we got wind that there was a big illegal logging operation taking place in a protected area in Cambodia. So we went on the ground, started investigating what was going on there. We found that a cartel of Vietnamese timber companies had come together to form a group that was basically sponsoring massive illegal logging in protected areas across the border in Cambodia. They took huge amounts of timber. I think about up to 300,000 cubic meters of timber was stolen from those forests and taken across the border into Vietnam for processing. And of course, you can't do that in broad daylight, move all that wood across the border without quite a lot of corruption going on. Everyone was paid off, from the border guards to the forestry officials, even reached as high as the governor of Gia Lai province, which was a neighbouring province to where the logging was taking place. And in essence, the cartel was paying $45 per cubic meter to the various agencies to not intervene and let them get on with their business. And that led to a total of $13 million in bribes was paid by that cartel to various people, as I said, including the governor of the province of Gia Lai. So, of course, when we think about these crimes, talk about Papua and talk about the forests of Cambodia, these might seem quite remote, but illegal logging and deforestation directly impacts our climate, so it affects us all. But also consumers are unwitting accomplices in these crimes as well. A lot of these products, whether it be palm oil in places like Indonesia, or whether it be timber, hardwoods, which are processed in Vietnam, end up in the markets in Europe and America. And so it's important that we look at our responsibility. We don't just think the problem's over there. We all have a stake in this. And there's been some efforts in various countries to try and bring in laws that try and exclude illegal commodities from their markets. So, for example, in Europe, we have the European Union Timber Regulation, which makes it an offence to import timber that's been logged illegally. And we've just had a new regulation in Europe as well, which is targeting commodities that create deforestation, such as palm oil. Palm oil is in a lot of things we consume, and there's a widespread corruption in the award of contracts, concessions to grow palm oil. And the impact of these crimes on people in the forest, the local people, indigenous people, can be awful. We've come across cases in Kalimantan province in Indonesia, where the governor of that province, a guy called Sugianto, who we've known for a long time, is a real piece of work. This guy was there was a company trying to clear land in a place called Ketapang illegally to grow palm oil. The local community documented that this was illegal. They tried to complain about it, and they were met with severe repression by the local police, who were obviously in the pay of Sugianto. So that's another thing to be aware of. Often in these crimes, the local people suffer lose their livelihoods, they're intimidated, and often the state agencies, like the police, etc., are involved in repressing them, basically for money. So you can see corruption there is having a terrible impact on those communities. So I just want to finish by giving another example of a type of climate crime. It's a bit different. There's chemicals called hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs. These are widely used in air conditioning and cooling systems. They are increasingly being controlled in some parts of the world, particularly in Europe. Europe has a thing called the F-gas regulation. And these chemicals, HFCs, are real super pollutants. They're short-lived, but they're much, much more potent than CO2. And the European Union introduced a quota system. So they were going to slowly tighten that quota system to try and reduce the imports and the use of HFCs in Europe. And of course, it was very laudable and very worthy. But when you try and restrict those commodities, if you don't enforce it properly, it can lead to a thriving black market. And so EIA has been investigating this market in Europe, and we estimate up to a third of the total trade in HFCs in Europe is illegal and is responsible for quite large emissions. And these emissions all affect us all. And so we've done some investigations into that, and we found that some countries like Romania were allowing these chemicals in illegally because the border guards have been corrupted. And so it's another example of where good intentions are undermined by corrupt actors. And so, I just want to finish by saying that obviously corruption has a clear impact on environmental crimes, particularly crimes that affect the climate. And we're not doing enough to look at the corruption angles in these crimes. We're not involving anti-corruption agencies in these investigations early enough. And one thing we aren't doing, which we should be doing, is following the money. There's a woeful lack of attempts in these climate crimes to track the money, because the money will take us to the corrupt people behind these crimes. It's slowly getting a bit better. The Financial Action Task Force, for example, the global standard setter on anti-money laundering laws, has recently produced some landmark reports on environmental crime. And so it's important that we keep pushing for these financial agencies to get involved in these crimes, follow the money, find the corrupt actors, and put them behind bars. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julian. I know folks discreetly slipped in, but I'm not sure if people can see. But don't be shy. Feel free to move into a place where you're comfortable and you can see everyone. There are plenty of chairs scattered throughout this cozy room. Okay, I am going to transition now to a moderated conversation with my co-panelists. So a theme that I detected throughout all of your remarks, manifesting itself in different ways, is perhaps not surprisingly transparency. I believe each of you spoke to it explicitly. Julian, you reiterated the need to follow the money when it comes to environmental crimes, which are, of course, economic crimes. That is greatly facilitated by institutionalizing transparency, reporting requirements, whether nationally or internationally. It is further facilitated by laws on the books, Freedom of Information Act type laws, requirements by exchanges where shares are traded, companies being obligated to report on their books and their accounting. Jim, you spoke for the need of transparency over regulatory frameworks, and I thought specifically of climate finance, which to a layperson who may care greatly about their future, one of the future generations that Steve alluded to, the area of climate finance is practically impenetrable, so complex as to seem daunting. How can we maximize not only transparency but accessibility when it comes to understanding the system that the UNFCCC aspires to put in place to prevent or stave off disastrous global warming and climate change. And then finally and importantly, Steve, you spoke obviously in terms of moral corruption. I'd love to hear more about what you mean by defensive ethics, but also in your call to action, you also called for transparency. So if each of you could speak to this theme, building on your previous remarks, I'd be grateful. And Julian, let's start with you. We'll go in reverse order this time.
Obviously, Obviously, transparency is vital because corruption hides in the dark where it can't be seen. It's very important that people have access to information such as concession maps and these kinds of things, so we can see where things are being done illegally. Transparency can help local researchers and investigators to see where logging is taking place outside of concessions or where land is being cleared illegally without a permit. So it's really important that these data sets are available. They're often not available to the public in these countries, so there's a big problem there. In terms of the financial aspects, we've been doing quite a bit of work the last couple of years to work with the banking sector to help them to recognize how these crimes look in terms of the financial flows, where the main financial flows move between. And we regularly supply information to banks from open source data to help them do their know your customer checks, because we believe that if you can start tracking the money flows, you can start having a good impact on these crimes. So transparency is key, and particularly for journalists and activists to be able to show where these crimes are taking place and to push the government to take action, because, as I said before, despite the growing impact of environmental crime on us all, most governments have been quite slow to respond to these challenges, particularly traditional police services. They see these crimes as not really serious crimes compared with things like drug smuggling or gun smuggling, but they are crimes that affect us all. And we must change that sort of low risk, high profit dynamic of these crimes and start being serious about these crimes. And transparency is vital to tackling these types of things, particularly in the forestry sector.
One quick follow-up question. You spoke to bank secrecy. What, if anything, can civil society and the press do in terms of accessing information, specifically financial information? As I said before, I come from a background as a former federal prosecutor, but obviously the grand jury subpoena is available to a very few. So to what extent can that transparency facilitate access to information from non-governmental organizations?
Well, yeah, I mean, as an NGO, it's very difficult to access financial information. We come across it in our investigations, but we're not able to access bank accounts, that sort of thing. That's not what we do. It's not probably legal to do so in many places, but what we can do is hand that information that we have from our investigations over to the banks and get them to do their investigations. We also have been forming relationships with financial intelligence units in these countries. Financial intelligence units are the body that regulates the banks. So we try and get information into their hands so they can be aware of what to look for when they're combing through different accounts. So there are patterns and flows to these crimes. As we saw, sometimes these criminals aren't doing anything particularly clever with their money because they don't think they're going to be looked at. And there's a case of that policeman in Papua. He was moving money through his accounts quite openly. He wasn't trying to do anything clever, and he wasn't charged with money laundering at first, which shows you the weaknesses in the system. But I think the financial aspects of these crimes are ones we should be targeting. But civil society, obviously, we can't go around hacking bank accounts, even if we wanted to. So we have to use our intelligence from our investigations to try and piece together what we call typologies, where we try and show how the money is moving in different parts of the supply chain.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So access to information, of course, is fundamental for many reasons. We often argue, obviously, for controlling corruption, but also just for making governments more responsive to people, more accountable, and doing a better job of delivering what people want. So that's something we routinely support around the world, including through open government initiatives. And it's very much a country-specific sort of discussion about where they stand in terms of establishing a legal framework, establishing institutional mechanisms for providing information, et cetera. So, excuse me, extremely important. When it comes to specifically to, as I said, the intersection between controlling corruption and climate change, we also emphasize the need for transparency in many things, including the processes on climate finance. So if it's finance that goes through the World Bank, then of course it's subject to our own access to information policies. And I think that should be pretty transparent. Maybe if you have something specific in mind that makes it hard to follow, I'd be interested in hearing that. But But we also think it's important to recognize that what, transparency in the things that we are involved in is one thing, but helping countries to build that transparency to apply more generally to their own policymaking processes, to important information. PPPs, as I mentioned in my talk, is extremely important. And I should say also, I found this to be an area where it's easy to get the attention of our macroeconomist friends, because they're also interested in these hidden liabilities and things like that. And so the more that something like these deals and subsidies, the more they can be made transparent and clear, and go through a process where they're not hidden liabilities. And often, to be honest, the fact that they're hidden liabilities often stops them from going forward at all. So it's not just a matter of hidden liabilities. In some cases, it's a matter of investments in, for example, renewables being slow to move forward because it's not transparent enough, and then that causes a wrench to get into the whole machinery. So building the better system of transparency up front helps to move the process along better and also reduce those macro risks.
Yeah, thank you. So maximizing efficiency up front and anticipating, as you say, those hidden liabilities. Steve.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very interesting stuff. I think a big topic to talk about what defensive ethics involves here. Partly what I have in mind is there's such a strong status quo bias towards the current generation and the most affluent countries and particular powerful actors in the global economy that attempts to try and defend appropriate norms with respect to future generations in particular, but also the global poor and marginalized communities are going to meet with a lot of resistance. And one form that resistance often takes is criticism of norms, principles, or institutions that might fill well-known gaps in how we deal with these things. Where I think a lot of the time the criticism is the sort of criticism that could equally be labeled at lots of other norms, principles, and institutions that already exist. So that standards around change, given the status quo bias, initiatives around change are held to a much higher standard than existing initiatives are. And that means that somehow the wider community, including the anti-corruption community perhaps, needs to play a role in defending the aspirations for better norms, principles, and institutions against this kind of constant corrosive attack. So, I mean, that can include continuing to point out the deficiencies of current institutions, norms, and principles, and continuing to push for change. I think sometimes that involves a more active kind of transparency than we sometimes see. And something I have in mind here, thinking an illustration around intergenerational issues, is, rather than searching for simple disclosure from particular actors or seeking to convict certain actors against very high standards of proof of corruption, sometimes what we need to do is to insist on new standards to which the conditions of transparency can be applied. Here's in some ways a trivial example, though a very important one. Conventional climate modeling and the conventional IPCC reports continue even now in 2022 to emphasize the temperature rise we would expect in 2100, as if nothing happens after 2100. Whereas future generations will be deeply concerned about what happens over the next few centuries. And if we had visuals, I show you a graph of the projected range of temperatures, even for the next century, which if you include it, this century looks bad on this scale, and suddenly it gets much worse in the future. So if we could, encourage an environment where people are transparent about, including mainstream science is transparent about the very long-term consequences for future generations, and establish more norms around that, I think that would be very helpful. But that requires a more active effort, right, of identifying where the gaps are and what sorts of information we need in order to effectively fight this kind of intergenerational corruption.
I'm going to pose one more thematic question to our panelists, and then we're going to open it up for full discussion. It seems to me, listening to all of you articulate needs, challenges, and the path forward, that a necessary precondition to successfully addressing both corruption and climate change is political will. Julian, your cross-border investigations inevitably run into roadblocks, maybe not insurmountable, but related to sovereignty, borders, and to use your first example of the local police officer, a lack of political will to hold accountable one's own. Jim, you spoke in terms of corruption favoring the status quo, and indeed reinforcing and entrenching, particularly in places of extreme income inequality and power inequality, that power elite. And Steve, in your call to action, you intriguingly invited all of us to join your effort for a global constitutional convention resulting in better institutions. And the question of political will to make that happen comes to mind immediately. So I'm going to mix it up this time and ask each of you to speak to challenges and opportunities you see with political will, this time starting with you, Julian.
It's not a very easy question to answer. I mean, obviously, we need our politicians, our leaders, to take these issues seriously and to put the right measures in place, and it can be done when the right political will is there. For example, just to mention Indonesia again, when I first started working in Indonesia, late 90s, around about 60% of the timber that was being logged in Indonesia was being logged illegally. It was a massive, massive problem in the country. From the west to the east, timber was flowing out from Indonesia, and it was all being logged illegally. I went to, some beautiful peat forest where home to orangutans. It was a protected area, allegedly protected area, and it was just, logging was totally open and blatant, and no one was doing anything about it at all. So we set about, EA and lots of other players set about trying to change that, and we didn't just focus on Indonesia itself, but we looked at the markets where this timber was going to, and we tried to get countries to work together with Indonesia, and that, has made some progress. It's not perfect, but now there's been a reduction in deforestation rates in Indonesia. There was in 2005, a new administration came into power, run by Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. He made tackling illegal logging a priority, and he empowered his minister to set up a task force, and they went into Papua, the place I spoke about before, and they basically shut down illegal logging operations across the island. So it can be done if the will is there. It's not impossible, but also no country alone can solve its problems. So the market side is very important as well. And the European Union signed a partnership agreement with Indonesia to try and make sure that any timber coming into the European Union from Indonesia was verified as legal. So when the political will is there and it's supported by other countries, we can see change. But unfortunately, these are rays of light in what it can be quite a dark situation in some places. But we know how to do these things. We know what the answer is. We need to put resources into tackling these crimes. We need to have appropriate sentencing, and we need the market to be involved as well. We can't just look at the forest countries. We need to look at where those commodities are going to. As I said before, Europe has now put in regulations that mean you have to carry out due diligence when you're importing things like soya or palm oil to make sure it's not coming from illegal sources. So this is part of the answer as well. So I'm an optimist by nature, despite things I see in my daily work.
But where political will is there, we can see the change, but it's trying to generate that political will that can be a stumbling block. Thanks.
Steve.
Yeah, thanks. I knew I'd get a version of that question. I always do. I actually think that we might be we are in the grip of a severe case of institutional denial if what we think is that we already have good institutions that are capable of dealing with a problem like climate change. It's genuinely global, seriously intergenerational, and also environmental ecological, which we're not astoundingly good at already. So now, one thing that could be meant by the problem of political will is to invoke what I think of as the tyranny of the contemporary, the dominance of the current generation, especially the affluent within it, as being an inevitable fact of political life, that each generation will simply be ruthless in exploiting its position. That's a possible outcome of my analysis that would happen, right? But I think that's the problem we're trying to resist. I also think, although it could be true, I doubt that it's actually true that most generations are completely ruthless. And that's because I think most generations have substantial numbers of people in those generations who care deeply for ethical and other reasons for future people. What I doubt is that we have effective institutions to put that concern into action at the moment, or at least that the other institutions that are around tend to be most strongly driven by pretty short-term and narrowly economic forces, and they effectively crowd out intergenerational concern. So my view is we need to enable that intergenerational concern to get traction in the world by empowering institutions to represent that concern, so giving them some power relative to other institutions. Right now, in practice and even analytically, we go around acting as if the following is a plausible basic assumption that we should make. I've heard major people in international relations and say this sort of thing. The baseline assumption is that nation states, as we understand them, are effective intergenerational stewards for their own people, at least, over many generations, so over hundreds, maybe, hundreds of years at least. And I think that's just the sort of assumption that once you state it, my colleague, my friend would, in the philosophy talk, would often say it doesn't pass the basic laugh test, right? If you're looking around at conventional institutions to think that they're really good at promoting long-term intergenerational concerns, even of their own people, doesn't look that plausible. What looks more plausible is something like the short-term, narrowly economic focus. And if that's the shape of our current institutions, then we're going to need some institutions capable of resisting that. And also, in my view, those kinds of institutions will reflect the will of the people, but they will reflect a different aspect of the will of the people, which is a phenomenon we're familiar with in other areas of governance, right? We don't expect there just to be one institution that has a monopoly on the will of the people, especially if a foundational concern here, the concern for future generations, is being neglected.
Thanks to you all. We are going to transition now to the fully My God. Thank you, Jim. Last word to Jim. No,
I almost escaped the political will question.
No. I'm holding you accountable.
Yeah, so great question. Political will, we discuss a lot in anti-corruption circles as, it's the thing everyone knows is necessary. It's not as easy to say, well, how do you, as an external observer or participant, how do you influence or help bring that about? And I think it's something that applies not only to control of corruption, it applies to all sorts of policies, and even, I think, well-meaning leaders operate within a certain political environment, and when they try to do something to disrupt the status quo, then the people who are benefiting from the status quo are going to try to use their own influence, whether it's corrupt or otherwise, to try to stop that happening. So it's certainly a very difficult terrain to engage in. But we had a good discussion yesterday, actually, on not about corruption per se, but about institutional development, economic development, and the role of sort of the person on top, and heard some, examples of countries where someone comes in and they, lead the country through some reforms over some period of time, leads to some positive effect. But you also have examples where it's much harder to pin down and put on a person. But in those cases, it's much more, I think, a matter of being able to have sufficient demand for a better situation coming from the citizenry, coming from the private sector, to be able to start and perpetuate those changes. And so then the question comes, what can be done to try to stimulate that demand for reforms and for improvements? And here we come back to things like transparency. So in my bio, I do say I'm a governance data junkie, which is why I quoted that survey. But I think data also serves a very instrumental purpose in being able to give people something to latch on to be able to go to the next step, which is to hold leaders accountable for where things are going. So we do support these transparency initiatives, as I mentioned, generally. Also things like EITI, I think, is relevant for this discussion. And I would say it's not only the transparency of the data in the sense of trying to, as something for being able to catch people doing wrong things. It's also that it gives a platform, and this was my observation, for example, in EITI in Mongolia when I was there, that the simple annual event to discuss progress itself gave a platform for discussing and raising other issues. And I think that's all part of it. So it's really a lot of small steps. I don't think there's anything we can do to sort of say, okay, you must have political will. That we don't get very far that way, but by helping with the better transparency, better data, better systems of accountability, then we can move forward. Thanks.
Thank you. And you named some of the stakeholder groups: the citizenry, the private sector, civil society, the press, and yes, those public-private partnerships, which can, for which transparency and standards can be identified and established up front. Now we transition to the fully interactive aspect of our discussion. I do see some hands, and I fully plan to call on them. However, there are several resources that I have previously identified who are here and are going to share their perspectives to start out. So first, Siri, are you here? Siri Nelson? No. Okay, thank you. Simon from WWF Madagascar, welcome. And I'm sorry, I think there's a floating mic somewhere in the room for questioners. That's true, we do not.
Yeah. Thank you. I apologize because English is not my first language. So I am Simon from Northwestern 2, and I work for WWF Madagascar as a chief of party for a project on anti-corruption and wildlife trafficking. So I'm not specialist of climate change, actually. So in the project, we have found that corruption is a driver for one of the drivers of wildlife trafficking in Madagascar, and we addressing it through our activities. When coming to climate change, as you may know it, island states like Madagascar are vulnerable to global warming. And we already see it in the country. And for example, in the south of Madagascar, it's a dry area. And because of the drought, people are moving from the south to the west and to the north. And the problem is they are installed in protected areas and with the involvement of local authority. So they pay bribes to the local authority to be put in the, because of lack of socioeconomic opportunities, they find everything in the protected areas. That's a problem. And it's interesting because we do have an national adaptation plan in Madagascar. We have a national strategy on corruption in Madagascar, but the issue is we don't see any concrete result on the ground. And when talking about political will, every government, I think, have political wills, but the problem is how they implement it. And the issue of transparency and communication are very, for me, very important. Because me as a citizen, I don't know what is happening. And at the last COP, for example, the government of Madagascar advocated to receive more money from the GCF, for example, but we don't know for what program, for what agenda. So, yeah, that's it. I will stop there. Just a reflection. Thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned lack of socioeconomic opportunity. That is certainly a cause of corruption. And without economic development, without increased socioeconomic opportunity, that is a cause that will not go away. Vera Wheat from WWF from the Greater Mekong region.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the invitations. Vera Wheat Tien Chainan, the Chief of Party of the USAID Mekong for the Future implemented by WWF. These projects, I think, just maybe piggyback on the last question on political will. So this project is working to strengthen civil society engagement in natural resource governance, because we believe that the theory of change is that the political will doesn't come by itself. So civic engagement, democracies, and governance kind of like working together. So I would like to support civil society to be able to engage in natural resource governance and the anti-corruption. So what we have seen, and I asked Megan when I was invited to chair in these sessions, that what is climate corruption, because that kind of term is kind of like new to me. When it was explained to me that it's about when climate change disaster happened, then corruptions also follow. So we will be able to give some example of that in the regions. And I asked her, how long do I have? Because it probably speak for hours if you have to be able to share all the experience that we have. And communities and civil society have been experiencing a lot of this disaster that happening more and more in the Greater Mekong regions, which cover like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Thailand. So when it can be like too hot, too cold, too much water, too less water, all of that kind of like happens. And then when those happen, we are looking at climate change on not only the effect, the impact of the climate change, but also on the cost of the climate change as well. Transboundary investment coming from the big country up north into our regions actually make their way to the corruption means in getting their projects approved, passing the EAA, and all those things that happens. And that also caused the changes in the nature of the people where they're living in the forests, near the rivers, Mekong rivers, and so on. And as a result of that, when the natural disaster came in, the politicians and the crony private sector also saw that not only the crisis, but the opportunity for them to thrive. Ask the people, how are you doing with the natural disaster, with the flooded? Some villages have been inundated for like 4 months. They lost their crops, everything, all their livelihood. And if you ask the public officials and the business, how they're doing, they said the business is good. Because what? The politician passed the emergency assistance bill, the public officials distribute those money. And for some reasons, the flood that happened like 4 years ago, people are saying that now we are flooded again, but the money that we should have received 4 years ago hasn't arrived yet. So talking about corruption, I think that's kind of like the situation that we are facing in, and we're crossing in the way that, I mean, because we are working to support the civil society, and I think we would be able to maybe working together as more. I think EIA would be able to spearhead in that investigation, and we would be able to bring civil society to support. Thank you.
Thank you for highlighting the aspect of profiteering in the wake of climate events. Okay, a number of hands, I'm sorry, gentlemen in the dark jacket in the back, you first. Sorry, no, you, sir. Yes.
Hi, thanks. I'm Brice from Transparency International. I lead our work on climate integrity. I wanted to follow up on what you said regarding reforming institutions, and I wanted to ask if you could maybe elaborate a bit more. There is, I mean, at the COP27, we heard about the Bridgetown Agenda, which is looking at reforming financial institutions. Then, I mean, I don't know if you were going in that direction or talking about a ministry for the future for those who might have read the book or anything. So if you could, elaborate or new social contract. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm probably thinking about a new social contract level. I don't think we want something. I don't know anything about the Bridgetown Initiative, so I should say that. But I don't. My instinct is we shouldn't have something flowing out of the UNFCCC process because it's too influenced by certain kinds of governments and certain kinds of interests. And if we're going to have a genuinely global, intergenerational set of institutions, then we would need them to have a different focus than we could expect from flowing out of the UNFCCC. And then an interesting project is trying to figure out exactly what would be the guidelines for bringing together what I think of as a global constitutional convention to discuss the best way to design and then implement such institutions. But I do think they would be distant from current institutions. As you heard, I think it's hard to deny that the UNFCCC process has been a failure. It's tempting to say so far, but when you've given an institution 30 years and you're as big a hole as we're in, I'm pretty comfortable dropping the so far. Doesn't mean that it couldn't be used for some useful purpose, but I think it would probably have to be used by something like a more powerful intergenerational set of institutions.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Thong Supraj. I'm from TI Cambodia. So I want to add up more information from Julia that your finding is not exclusive enough information about from climate crime to climate change. So the problem logging in Cambodia is very disaster based on the report from Global Witness and also with activity. I also activist on that issue. And I am former 10 years with social and political columnist for Phnom Penh Post. So I would say that Cambodia is suffer from the political influence from 10 years with Vietnam invasions and also with China dominant now from under the One Belt One Road initiative. So that this policy is too big impact to Cambodia, very easy to pick shipping the logging, the woods. So when you see that the Vietnam company Vietnam into Cambodia is just shipping outside from Cambodia, but you see more the behind that is China is the big demanding from the supply side. So this issue is the government try to allow to do that because of the influence or dominated by political in China in Cambodia now very disaster. and government to take advantage from that because they try to fight the opposition party, take China more the money, just money, including from the bank as well. When we talking about the financial flow, they have another tactics through the bank. So the bank example like the Prince or some Chinese bank in Cambodia. So the dirty money goes through that. So and then with including they do more emphasize with the real estate. Take the money from that and then they go through the real estate. So in this case, it's difficult for Cambodia at the moment is one single party. When the people talking about the environment, talking about climate change, people scared of the threat from the CPP. The government is take power 40 years, and Prime Minister Hun Sen, you can see, is more than 30 years he took power. So it's dominated by single party. It's very difficult for activists, even right activists or political activists or environment activists. One guy is one famous. You can check with Chudwati. He was that, and Obama give him the appreciation during Obama administration. And another one is talking about global Venus. Political analyst Kamlay. He's after 2 days later. He was dead. So that is really blocked, and then government take advantage more, dominated by all the media. So it's only a few for international like Al Jazeera or CNN or BBC, they can cover the story of the environment. So it is a very difficult challenge from Cambodia now. Right activists and all corruption, so we are also this very difficult situation at the time. So that's over from my side. Thank you. We can talk more.
No, I mean, what you're facing in Cambodia is grand corruption right to the very top, and it's very difficult to tackle. And there's violence against people who are trying to expose these things is widespread, and also the free press has been curtailed in Cambodia. So it's a very difficult situation you face, and all we can do is try and support those people who are trying to track those crimes quietly and try and get the information out there where we can. But of course, some of the wood that's leaving Cambodia illegally is ending up in a market somewhere as well. So all we can do really for EIA is try and look at the market side, because the timber I described as going from Vietnam into Vietnam in that case, a lot of that would have probably been processed and moved onward for export. It wasn't being all consumed in Vietnam. So it's important that we look at the whole supply chain. And as I said before, there are controls in place in places like Europe now, where you have to show you've conducted due diligence before you bring in any timber. It doesn't solve the problem, but when you're facing the challenges you face in Cambodia, all you can do is to try and sort of cut off the market for these commodities. But I really empathise with your plight there.
Thank you. The lady in the black and red shawl.
I just want to make a comment more about what you were saying, but from the citizens' point of view. I think one problem that I see, and look, I'm being in this thing for many, many years. I'm not, I do know a little bit about what is going on, but I think the majority of the citizens don't even understand how to participate in this thing. Because when you say climate change, it's this enormous thing. We know that this is multifaceted, complex, has a lot of different pieces, and I don't see this really communicated in a way that people at the country level can participate in an effective way. Because the only thing you can do is go into the streets with a sign that says, my government should do something about climate. You know that in every country, the way that those countries contribute to climate change is different. I wish, all the organizations working on this in a country like Ecuador, for example, get together and say, what are the 5 drivers to climate that this country is contributing to? And give people a much more nuanced way to participate in this conversation. Because otherwise it's like, eat less meat, turn your heat off. Yeah, all is fine. All citizens should do that. But if you want this other level of change you're talking about in institutions, I don't think it's lack of institutions. I think it's that we don't even know how to influence those institutions now, because this is just too complicated and people are not being explained this in a strategic, down-to-earth, piecemeal way. In Ecuador, probably there's 5 main things that the government can do, because those are the most contributing to climate change from the perspective of Ecuador. So we are involved in this conversation of North should pay the South and all those kind of things, and we don't do anything. So I think it would be useful if, organizations will get together. I have gone to the COP and stopped going to the COP because I thought it was the most stupid meeting in my life. 20,000 people running around the corridors with no guidance about what to do, and the only decision makers are locked up in some room where nobody can access. There's no voting from the people outside about what people inside are. There's not even information flowing. If you're not an insider, know somebody that knows somebody, you don't know what's going on. So if we continue this way, this idea that institutions don't work, because I think we're not giving people a way to connect with those institutions and do it in an effective way. My problem to me is that I think this has to be break down to regular pieces that you can deal with. I've been in anti-corruption all my life, and you know what I decided 3 years ago? I'm going to pick something like this, because I worked 20 years on changing everything in my country. Wasn't working that much. Now I do fish. I want transparency in fisheries, period. And then I'm going to get somewhere there because it's sizable, it's manageable. I know, and this is a huge problem still, but at least it's more, I can understand what I'm doing now. I think climate has the same problem. So I don't know what your reaction is to that, but I feel that you want the citizens to be heard, but we are not giving real citizens a way into this that makes any sense.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of your concerns, and I stopped going to the COP about 10 years ago as well. So I think those are real concerns, but I also think we got a massive structural problem around intergenerational concern. It shows up in a big way in climate. I think it shows up in other areas as too. I think it's going to get worse over the next century or so as the scale of activity by humans is already ramped up and continues to ramp up. So even if we didn't need it for climate, I think we would need a structural intervention of the sort that I'm talking about intergenerational concern. So basically, I don't really see an alternative, and it's tempting to think that, try for something more manageable, maybe more local, something that each of us as individuals can make more of a contribution to. And maybe that's good at the level of, living a worthwhile life.
Sorry. I think that I did not explain myself. It's how to influence our government. Instead of giving us, eat less, this and that. No. What are the 5 things that you should go after your government and do something? People can understand. There's 5 things in Ecuador that need to be done as a country. Instead of climate is a problem. Nobody can get that. It's just too much.
Yeah, well, partly what I want them to do is to acknowledge they're not up to the task and allow some room for institutions that might actually be up for the task, including at the domestic level, right? Yeah, I originally wrote my first paper on this topic because I was invited to be part of a centenary issue of Ethics and International Affairs, the journal, and we were specifically asked to say, what about the problem you work on, in my case, climate change, do you think is a really big central problem that just nobody's talking about? And at that stage, I think that was it, right? This question of, are our institutions up to it? And is it worth spending another decade, another 30 years trying to do marginal kinds of changes within the institutions we actually have? Or should we take a step back and try to get a sense of why are they failing? And there are multiple reasons, but one of the reasons I think is they're totally not trustworthy when it comes to intergenerational concern. There's no reason to think they would be good at that. There are lots of reasons historically to think they would be bad at it, including the climate crisis. And maybe it's time to have a serious discussion about that. And I think a global constitutional convention would be a good venue for that discussion.
Final question, sir.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Samuel Kaninda is my name. I'm with Transparency International. I'm going to convey a comment or a question from an online participant. His name is Scott Hedgehost. He's asking the panelists to comment on the role of whistleblowers that you protect and how do you incentivize them. So that's the question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think obviously whistleblowers play a key part in exposing misdoing and criminality, and often they can be well-placed sources of information, but of course there have to be safeguards in place to make sure they are kept safe. I'm not an expert on whistleblowers myself, I guess, in a way. EIA is a type of whistleblower, in that we get information from the field and then we publish the information, but we take very much care about how we do our investigations and make sure we can do them safely and securely. But some of the best sources we've met over the years have been people who are insiders, people inside ministries, that sort of thing, and we take great steps to make sure that we protect their identity if we use their information. I don't know if you have anyone else to add to that?
I'm committing to ending our session on time, so with the 60 seconds remaining, I'm going to sum up. Jim said that complexities open up space for corruption. We live in a complex time, to say the least. Steve said that the concept that nations are stewards for future generations doesn't pass the basic laugh test. Stakeholders, many of whom are represented by you in this room today, are essential for highlighting, exposing, and then affecting public policy in the space of public corruption and climate change. I submit that anti-corruption best practices are an essential part of both natural resource management and governance, and also efforts to prevent future extreme weather and climate change from running away from the planet altogether. Civil society, freedom of association, a robust press, and yes, those other institutions must not be undermined by corruption. If I weren't an idealist, it would be hard to work in this space at all, but I am an idealist without illusions. And so I found myself thinking of an old speech, but it's still timeless. And that was a speech given in 1963 by John F. Kennedy at American University. And he closed by saying, "For in the final analysis, we all breathe the same air, we all inhabit the same small planet, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." I can't think of a better way to end. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.